coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Trump is portrayed as this malign force that somehow turned Republicans in the election season against funding, muddied the waters, and stood in the way of some victory. It's emphasized in the article. It says there was broad based bipartisan support for funding Ukraine with weapons and fairly broad support in public opinion for this conflict until the 2024 election season and Trump's rhetorical trickery and wizardry in turning Americans against it. Whereas I would posit that had Americans known, you don't need to know all of the operational details and intelligence sharing and all that. But if the American people had known the extent to which we were fully enmeshed and directing most of this war, with some exceptions when the Ukrainians decided to go off the reservation, and they had understood the closeness with which we got to a possible tactical nuke or nukes being launched by Russia. I think public opinion support of this would have collapsed probably in the middle of 22 or late 22, 6 to 7, 8 months after the war started. That part of it is left out, the extent to which American opinion has been manipulated on this issue by the Biden administration from the outset. And in that way, it's of a piece with our conduct in all of our recent wars, both bigger and smaller. Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast at the American Mind and of the Claremont Institute, at the Claremont Institute. I don't know. You all know the drill. I'm your host this week, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind. I am joined by Mike Sabo, managing editor of the American Mind, and Jeremy Carl, senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, Interior Department denizen of the first Trump administration. Many of you know Jeremy through his excellent and incisive commentary on X or his writing on the American Mind or elsewhere. And I encourage you all, we've talked about it before, but if you haven't yet bought it, buy Jeremy's now not so new book, although fairly recent book, The Unprotected Class, about the rise of identity politics in America. And Spencer is off in Hungary, so he's in absentia, our Magyar editor of the American Mind. But we wanted to bring up this remarkable long essay in the New York Times called The Partnership: The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. It's a piece by one of their longstanding national security reporters, Adam Entous, and we thought it was revealing and interesting for a variety of reasons. I'll state out of the gate one of the main reasons is for those that are not as familiar with how the ecosystem of elite journalism works in Washington, D.C. The New York Times, pieces like this in the New York Times, pieces like this in Washington Post, have served the function for at least probably 40 years, if not slightly longer, of providing a nice window into what the intelligence community and the kind of diplomatic and national security bureaucracy wants you to think about stuff. It's a little unfair to some of the more honest reporters, but it's not crazy to call this sort of piece serving a role as a kind of stenography for the deep state's narrative construction for America. So this is like a 13,000 word essay. For fans of the Matt Taibbi and Walter Kern podcast, some of this may be some well-trodden ground. They went through this in great detail, but I think a lot of our listeners maybe haven't seen this piece or haven't sat down to read it in full. I just want to read their key takeaways, which is the shorter article summary, and then I'll just dip into a few choice passages from the longer piece, and then Jeremy and Mike and I can discuss the many aspects of it. The first headline or subhead of the takeaway piece is titled "A U.S. Base in Wiesbaden, Germany, Supplied the Ukrainians with the Coordinates of Russian Forces on Their Soil." The idea behind the partnership was that America's close cooperation with Ukraine would compensate for Russia's vast advantages in manpower and weaponry. To guide the Ukrainians as they deployed their ever more sophisticated arsenal, the Americans created an operation called Task Force Dragon. The secret center of the partnership was at the U.S. Army garrison in Wiesbaden, Germany. Each morning, U.S. and Ukrainian military officers set targeting priorities: Russian units, pieces of equipment, or infrastructure. American and coalition intelligence officers searched satellite imagery, radio emissions, and intercepted communications to find Russian positions. Task Force Dragon then gave the Ukrainians the coordinates so they could shoot at them. Military officials worried that it might be unduly provocative to call the targets targets. Instead, they were referred to as points of interest. Next subhead. U.S. intelligence and artillery helped Ukraine quickly turn the tide against the Russian invasion. In spring 2022, the Biden administration agreed to send high mobility artillery systems, or HIMARS, which use satellite guided rockets for strikes up to 50 miles distant. In the war's first year, the Ukrainians were extremely dependent on the Americans for intelligence, and Task Force Dragon vetted and oversaw virtually every HIMARS strike. The strikes caused Russian military casualty rates to soar, and Ukraine's 2022 counteroffensive was largely successful. By December, the Ukrainians held an unlikely David versus Goliath upper hand against their Russian foe. Next subhead. The Biden administration kept moving its red lines. From the first, administration officials sought to lay down a red line. America was not fighting Russia, it was helping Ukraine. Still, they worried that steps taken to accomplish that might provoke Mr. Putin to attack NATO targets or perhaps make good on his nuclear threats, even as the administration developed an ever greater tolerance of risk to help Ukraine meet the evolving threat. Many of the most potentially provocative steps were taken in secret. These are some of the steps. Easing a prohibition against American boots on Ukrainian ground, Wiesbaden was allowed to put a dozen military advisors in Kiev. To avoid drawing public attention to their presence, the Pentagon initially called them subject matter experts. Later, the team was expanded to about 3 dozen. Second point. In 2022, the U.S. Navy was authorized to share targeting information for Ukrainian drone strikes on warships just beyond the territorial waters of Russian annexed Crimea. The CIA was allowed to support Ukrainian operations within Crimean waters. That fall, the spy agency covertly helped Ukrainian drones strike Russian warships in the port of Sevastopol. In January 2024, U.S. and Ukrainian military officers in Wiesbaden jointly planned a campaign using coalition supplied long range missiles along with Ukrainian drones to attack about 100 Russian military targets across Crimea. The campaign, named Operation Lunar Hail, largely succeeded in forcing the Russians to pull equipment, facilities, and forces in Crimea back to the Russian mainland. Next subhead. Ultimately, the U.S. military and CIA were allowed to help with strikes into Russia. The hardest red line was the Russian border, but in spring 2024, to protect the northern city of Kharkiv against a Russian assault, the administration authorized the creation of an ops box, a zone of Russian territory within which U.S. officers in Wiesbaden could provide the Ukrainians with precise coordinates. The box's first iteration extended across a wide swath of Ukraine's northern border. The box was expanded after North Korea sent troops to help fight the Ukrainians' incursion into Russia's Kursk region. The U.S. military was later allowed to enable missile strikes in an area of southern Russia where the Russians staged forces and equipment for their offensive in eastern Ukraine. Long-standing policy barred the CIA from providing intelligence on targets on Russian soil, but the CIA could request variances, carve-outs to support strikes for specific objectives. Intelligence had identified a vast munitions depot in Toropets, 290 miles north of the Ukrainian border. On September 18, 2024, a swarm of drones slammed into the munitions depot. Later, the CIA was allowed to enable Ukrainian drone strikes in southern Russia to try to slow advances in eastern Ukraine. And then this concluding paragraph. The 2023 counteroffensive was meant to build momentum after the first year's triumphs, but after the partners held war games in Wiesbaden and agreed on a strategy, the plan ran headlong into Ukrainian politics. The Ukrainian Armed Forces Chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, embraced the plan, whose centerpiece was an assault in the direction of the southern city of Melitopol that would cut off Russian supply lines. But his rival and subordinate, Colonel General Alexander Siersky, had his own plan to impale Russian forces in the occupied eastern city of Bakhmut. Ukrainian President Zelensky sided with him and divided up the ammunition and forces between two main fronts instead of one. Ukrainians never did reclaim Bakhmut, and within months, the counteroffensive ended in failure. Russia now had the upper hand. That's where the article ends. Those are just some of the highlights. I just wanted to now just go through a few of the more eyebrow-raising parts of the very long essay, then we'll get into it. This is the partnership is the subject of the its here. Its evolution and inner workings visible to only a small circle of American and allied officials, that partnership of intelligence, strategy, planning, and technology would become the secret weapon in what the Biden administration framed as its effort to both rescue Ukraine and protect the threatened post-World War II order. Today, that order, along with Ukraine's defense of its land, teeters on a knife edge as President Trump seeks rapprochement with Mr. Putin and vows to bring the war to a close. It details the extent to which, at one point, Some of our NATO partners were surprised, and the revealing excerpt is here. One European intelligence chief recalled being taken aback to learn how deeply enmeshed his NATO counterparts had become in Ukrainian operations. They are part of the kill chain now, he said. And the they there, I should add, obviously is mostly the US, although France, Poland, and others were involved, but we were definitely the leading partner. So, the narrative sort of goes through at the beginning, starting in spring of 2022, soon after the invasion, this partnership spools up and it gets notches a lot of wins, increases the Ukrainians' confidence, and gives them some hope for succeeding relatively early. But the stalking shadow, which a lot of the critics of the war in the US recognized early on, us at the American Mind and elsewhere included, is encapsulated here. The partnership operated in the shadow of deepest geopolitical fear that Mr. Putin might see it as breaching a red line of military engagement and make good on his often brandished nuclear threats. The story of the partnership shows how close the Americans and their allies sometimes came to that red line, how increasingly dire events forced them, some said too slowly, to advance it to more perilous ground, and how they carefully devised protocols to remain on the safe side of it. Time and time again, the Biden administration authorized clandestine operations it had previously prohibited. American military advisors were dispatched to Kiev and later allowed to travel closer to the fighting. Military and CIA officers in Wiesbaden helped plan and support a campaign of Ukrainian strikes in Russian annexed Crimea. Finally, the military and then the CIA received the green light to enable pinpoint strikes deep inside Russia itself. New excerpt. Each point of interest, this is what they were calling the targets, recall, this is our euphemism to call targets. Each point of interest would have to adhere to intelligence sharing rules crafted to blunt the risk of Russian retaliation against NATO partners. There would be no points of interest on Russian soil. If Ukrainian commanders wanted to strike within Russia, General Zabrodsky explained they would have to use their own intelligence. And our message to the Russians was this war should be fought inside Ukraine, a senior U.S. official said. The White House also prohibited sharing intelligence on the locations of strategic Russian leaders, like the Armed Forces Chief, General Valery Gerasimov. Imagine how that would be for us if we knew that the Russians helped some other country assassinate our chairman, another senior U.S. official said. Like we'd go to war. Similarly, Task Force Dragon couldn't share intelligence that identified the locations of individual Russians. And then it goes through this sort of ladder of escalation. Initially, we authorized artillery M777s, which had a 15-mile radius. When that didn't prove to be enough, the HIMARS, which I mentioned before, at a range of 50 miles. And then some of you who've been following this closely may remember the talk of ATACMS. And the longer range satellite guided ATACMS could go 150 miles rather than 50 or 15. So we have this kind of ladder of escalation as this all plods along. I want to highlight, I should say, a couple more things and then we'll stop. At the White House, Mr. Biden and his advisors weighed that argument, that is the argument to give them HIMARS and then eventually attack them. It felt like standing on that line, the red line that is, wondering if you take a step forward, is World War III going to break out? And when the White House took that step forward, the official said Task Force Dragon was becoming the entire back office of the war. And then finally, this is probably the most alarming few paragraphs. And then we'll end with the end of the article because I think it's pretty revealing and it's a wonderful place to stop. Perhaps no piece of Ukrainian soil was more precious to Mr. Putin than Crimea. As the Ukrainians haltingly advanced on the Dnipro, it's the river, hoping to cross and advance toward the peninsula, this gave rise to what one Pentagon official called the core tension. To give the Russian president an incentive to negotiate a deal, the official explained, the Ukrainians would have to put pressure on Crimea. To do so, though, could push him to contemplate doing, quote, something desperate. The Ukrainians were already exerting pressure on the ground, and the Biden administration had authorized helping the Ukrainians develop, manufacture, and deploy a national fleet of maritime drones to attack Russia's Black Sea fleet. First, the Navy was allowed to share points of interest for Russian warships just beyond Crimea's territorial waters. In October, with leeway to act within Crimea itself, the CIA covertly started supporting drone strikes on the port of Sevastopol. That same month, U.S. intelligence overheard Russia's Ukraine commander, General Sergei Surovikin, talking about indeed doing something desperate, using tactical nuclear weapons to prevent the Ukrainians from crossing the Dnipro and making a beeline to Crimea. Until that moment, this is key. Until that moment, U.S. intelligence agencies had estimated the chance of Russia's using nuclear weapons in Ukraine to 5 to 10%. Now they said if the Russian lines in the south collapsed, the probability was 50%, and on and so forth. And then the concluding few paragraphs. So the original general coordinating, U.S. general that is coordinating out of Wiesbaden, was this guy, General Donahue. He left after 2 years, and then this is him now coming back late last year, I think. No, it was in early January, so right after or right before really, Trump was going to be inaugurated. I think I have that timeline right. Forgive me if it's a little off. But so much had changed since General Donahue left 2 years before. But when it came to the raw question of territory, not much had changed. In the war's first year, with Wiesbotten's help, the Ukrainians had seized the upper hand, winning back more than half of the land lost after the 2022 invasion. Now they were fighting over tiny slivers of ground in the east and in Kursk. One of General Donahue's main objectives in Wiesbaden, according to a Pentagon official, would be to fortify the Brotherhood and breathe new life into the machine, to stem, perhaps even push back the Russian advance. In the weeks that followed, with Wiesbaden providing points of interest and coordinates, the Russian march toward Pokrovsk would slow, and in some areas in the east, the Ukrainians would make gains. But in southwest Russia, as the Trump administration scaled back support, the Ukrainians would lose most of their bargaining chips at Kursk. In early January, Generals Donahue and Cavoli visited Kyiv to meet with General Syrskyi and ensure that he agreed on plans to replenish Ukrainian bridges and shore up their lines, the Pentagon official said. From there, they traveled to Ramstein Air Base, where they met Mr. Austin, that is Lloyd Austin, our former Secretary of Defense, for what would be the final gathering of coalition defense chiefs before everything changed. With the doors closed to the press and public, Mr. Austin's counterparts hailed him as the godfather and architect of the partnership that, for all its broken trust and betrayals, had sustained the Ukrainians' defiance and hope, begun in earnest on that spring day in 2022 when Generals Donahue and Zabrodsky first met in Wiesbaden. Mr. Austin is a solid and stoic block of a man, but as he returned the compliments, his voice caught. Instead of saying farewell, let me say thank you, he said, blinking back tears, and then added, I wish you all success, courage, and resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, carry on. Anyway, I recommend that you all go read that remarkable piece in the New York Times, The Partnership, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. Now, let me summarize it as follows. Our domestic leadership routinely and repeatedly were lying to us about the extent of our involvement in this conflict. I would say it was almost with a wink, wink, nod, nod, because it was clear that people on both sides of the aisle paying attention to this knew that we were doing quite a bit more than just giving weapons to the Ukrainians. But we were involved in a pretty hot proxy war with Russia, as we have been in the past, even in the post Cold War era, whether in Syria or at various points in much lower scale in Ukraine since 2014. They were lying to us about that. It turns out a lot of the fears of some of the critics of our involvement were spot on, that we were much closer at certain points to a nuclear exchange, or at least the prospect of one, had Putin fired tactical nuclear weapons in a hot combat zone for the first time since we did it in World War II. Ours weren't tactical, of course, but it would have been a major inflection point in the post-war era, to say the least. And it's clear throughout points in this article that the Americans' involvement was a bit of a catch-22 for the Ukrainians. You know, they wanted something more. They wanted big victories. They wanted to go big and win this thing, whatever that may mean. And we, though we were outwardly committed to winning this thing, whatever that meant, we were routinely, for obvious and perfectly rational reasons, preventing them from taking full advantage of US intelligence and military support, or at least materiel support, because of the fear of some Russian escalation. We did in this war what we've done in all of our wars, I would submit, since the end of World War II, which is we were kind of managing conflict rather than pursuing victory. Now, in the case of this conflict, it made perfect sense for us not to pursue victory because, after all, we were not at war with Russia. Ukraine was. So you can see this weird managerial approach and tactical approach to this war and our support for it doing two things: enabling Ukraine to continue, keeping them away from the negotiating table, but also preventing them from striking decisively, either to get themselves to the negotiating table or to get them to total victory. I think us on this podcast, probably half the country in the US, never thought was possible with Russia. So, in a way, that last poignant moment, or sad or tragic moment of rhetoric from General Austin, I bid you all farewell, keep up the fight, has resulted in a war of attrition, with us willing to fight to the last Ukrainian and grinding the. I shouldn't laugh, it's macabre. I take that chuckle back. It's just sort of a gallows humor at this point. Grinding Ukraine's youth into dust and a good portion of Russia's youth into dust as well. Those aren't moral equivalents, of course, as Russian was the aggressor in this, although there's a whole history of miscalculations by us and NATO leading up to this point. We can debate how much we pushed Russia into this at some later date. Doesn't excuse the aggression from Russia, but it as with all things in this sort of conflict, there's no pure white hats or pure black hats. Anyway, with all that, I'll stop there before I get myself into more trouble. I'll just conclude by saying, remember, this sort of piece is meant to convey the retroactive official narrative that the intelligence community of the United States would like to set. That's how it should be read, and in that sense, it's very, very revealing. Well, I said quite a bit. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, and I had a number of the similar thoughts to you. I mean, I keep in mind, I think it is important. I mean, it is really a shockingly official version, and I'd say two things about it. I think one is to keep in mind that a lot of what is in there may not even be true of its own lights.
Right.
There may be all sorts of reasons that they are using the New York Times to communicate it because it's kind of shocking the level to which they're like, okay, well, we're just going to tell you all our war plans and every war that happened. I mean, it's just kind of a shocking piece to read. I'd add to that other things that really shocked me. I guess maybe the shocking is not quite the word, but just so revealing the real absence of Europe as a serious player in any of this. I mean, they're on the periphery. Yes, this is telling the story from our perspective, but it just sort of reinforces the notion that a lot of us who've been critical of this have had from the beginning that here's this thing that is in the background, that's happening right in Europe's backyard. And yet we're kind of shouldering all the non Ukrainian load functionally. And for all of Europe's rhetoric, they don't seem to be significant players, nor do they, they're kind of playing seem to be getting more over time. You talk about the red lines, it was just kind of amazing. And again, the piece overtly points it out. It's like, hey, we had all these red lines, and we were, in the words of Dave Chappelle, habitual line steppers. We kept going right over those lines every single time, our red line. And again, none of this being voted on by Congress, as far as we know. I mean, maybe there was some secret thing going on in the Armed Services Committee or whatever, but none of this certainly being aware of the American people. And again, things that were sort of staggering to me. This, oh, we almost ran into this 50% chance of nuclear war, but then it just backed up because of circumstances changed a little bit. I mean, again, where is the authorization for that level of even possible involvement? And then I guess I'd say finally another thing that was really notable to me for its absence from this official account is there's very little discussion of corruption in Ukraine. I mean, it's not totally absent from the piece, but it's given what we at least have good reason to believe are the massive kind of levels of corruption in and around this war effort. The fact that that is kind of largely written out of the official story was really notable to me. So those are kind of my headline observations.
Yeah, the first thing to me that jumped out was, who wrote this? Adam Entous. Who is that? Remember back in 2016, he was tight with Fusion GPS. He used to work with the Wall Street Journal, and those guys came out of the Wall Street Journal. Won a Pulitzer perpetuating the Russia hoax. I think he was one of three people to receive that award. Carried water for the Biden family and Hunter Biden, basically kind of covered his tracks. Obviously, there's a lot of background with Ukraine there with Hunter Biden, so this is just kind of a piece with his larger work, which is to shield Americans from what's really going on, and essentially, you're right, Ryan. Like, be the stenographer of the deep state. He's deeply embedded in U.S. intelligence. He's been doing this for a very long time. So this is all very calculated. I mean, look at when this was released. Right as negotiations are happening to end the war. So trying to undercut that, I assume, in some way. I noticed too just some weird internal contradiction right at the heart of this. I mean, this attempt to blame Trump, he's kind of Putin's lackey, whatever, but it's like, but he clearly shows. I mean, the problems actually stem from Zelensky and picking one general over the other, and just the absolute inanacy just of what he was trying to do. And these, big kind of almost WWE like shock wins that would just catapult Ukraine to victory. I mean, it's just really silly. It's like the real world just doesn't work like that. So, piece that I think, kind of reminded me of like Alan Bloom's book, like it was bought off the shelves in 1987, millions and millions of copies. Who actually read it? And this is going to be the same thing. I mean, who's actually going to take the time to read through 13,000 words? but they're probably going to listen to the podcast. I think Entous did podcasts and audio recordings and everything of this too, kind of ready made for elite liberal consumption. And I think this is just going to keep forwarding, at least their narrative of Trump as kind of Putin's lackey again and somehow ending a war, which is what the US is trying to do. That itself is somehow corrupt. And clearly, we should have just given Ukraine everything they desired so they could beat evil Putin. I mean, you have this like Manichaean white versus black straight morality, and it's just at the heart of the liberal worldview. So those things just really jumped out at me.
On that last point, I thought it was interesting that at least two of Zelensky's generals, one of them for certain, did some of his training and education in Russia and spoke Russian at most meetings. I don't want to impute his motives at all. I just mean to say that it shows the messiness of this whole East-West Ukraine problem and the Russian-speaking East and the history of Ukraine stretching back much longer than anyone's, certainly at the New York Times, narrative memory will go. And on the Trump point, yeah, Trump is painted as a manipulator of public opinion and in a way is kind of the villain or a part of the villainy of the failure of us and the Ukrainians in Ukraine. The intelligence community obviously here is covering its in the sense that really, if only they'd just listened to us and Donahue and others carefully laid plans, and there hadn't been this internal fighting between Zelensky and his general and the general's subordinate, and the sacking of one and the replacing with the other, and the changed battle plans from what the U.S. recommended, then we would have gotten to the negotiating table somehow, I think, in 2023 is the implication, and would have brought this to some reasonable close. Leave aside, of course, the fact that the official narrative up until fairly recently in Washington, as early as a year and a half ago, maybe, in bipartisan official Washington, was that negotiating with Putin was evil and total victory, whatever that means, was the only thing we could accept. So Trump is portrayed as this malign force that somehow turned Republicans in the election season against funding, muddied the waters, and stood in the way of some victory. It's emphasized in the article. It says there was broad based bipartisan support for funding Ukraine with weapons and fairly broad support in public opinion for this conflict until the 2024 election season and Trump's rhetorical trickery and wizardry in turning Americans against it. Whereas I would posit that had Americans known, you don't need to know all of the operational details and intelligence sharing and all that. But if the American people had known the extent to which we were fully enmeshed and directing most of this war, with some exceptions when the Ukrainians decided to go off the reservation, and they had understood the closeness with which we got to a possible tactical nuke or nukes being launched by Russia. I mean, I think public opinion support of this would have collapsed probably in the middle of 22 or late 22, 6 to 7, 8 months after the war started. That part of it is left out, the extent to which American opinion has been manipulated on this issue by the Biden administration from the outset. And in that way, it's of a piece with our conduct in all of our recent wars, both bigger and smaller, whether it's with ISIS and Syria and arming of, quote unquote, moderate Islamic factions, or even a lot of the obfuscation and behind covering that was going on throughout the Iraq war as it evolved in its various stages. I mean, the Afghanistan withdrawal and the plans and the ways in which they were abandoned, and then the quick cover up of the disastrous pulling out, going all the way back to a lot of the American public souring on Vietnam amidst the perfectly rational conclusion that a lot of them made, that they weren't really being sold the whole truth about the matter. So it's a fairly detailed roadmap to the tactics and problems with our modern way of conducting war, coupled with our preening moralism and moral imperialism, which we've talked a lot about on the cultural front over recent months with USAID and everything else. But you see the extent to which we're just the big bully is not quite the right word, but we're the first among equals and then some in all of these conflicts over recent decades, whether they be in the Middle East or now even in the eastern part of Europe. And I think, Trump would like to change all of that. And it's one of the many reasons, it explains a lot of the reasons why the establishment is freaking out about Trump's second term and about his aggressive actions to try to bring some sanity and common sense back to America's conduct of the world.
And I think too, just to kind of, I guess, put maybe a close on this, it just shows the wisdom of you look at our approach, like you said, Ryan, since, really World War II, compared to the American founders, men like John Quincy Adams, go searching for monsters to destroy. I mean, this is why, you follow George Washington in the farewell address. Okay, you have amity and concord between nations, but I mean, you don't do stuff like this. This is how nations fail. This is how you lose. And you just see this time and time and time again. US generals, all these medals, what wars have they won? All this kind of Washington speak. I mean, it's amazing. Let's worry about the signal chat. It's like, okay, okay, sure, whatever, but like what are you guys doing at the Pentagon? That's why Pete Hegseth is there. That's why Trump is back in office again. So just the hubris to me, it's just the insane, just still inability to see reality, to acknowledge it in any way, shape, or form, really. And just Scott Adams, I keep kind of going back to this, just this other movie that they're watching. I mean, it's just a different universe that they're in.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that. I mean, I agree completely about the hubris. It's just reading this piece, the kind of desperate attempt of the reporter to like make everybody out into these grand heroes, particularly on our side, just painful, right? Like, yeah, I mean, it was like he was their press agent. And then no attempt to really contextualize, to go through in the John Quincy Adams sense, like what is America's interest here? What monster are we destroying from an American perspective? The whole thing was shocking, and I mean, it's not that there was no reaction to it, but the fact that everybody wasn't screaming from the rooftops about all these revelations is just also indicative of the kind of inability of the American public to kind of pay attention to things in favor of whatever Jeffrey Epstein is accused of this week. If I'm allowed to say that, just more minor matters to me. So it was a kind of a shocking and sobering at the same time.
Yeah, I encourage everyone. I keep hammering away at this, but pick up Angelo Codevilla's last book. It's basically a "What Would John Quincy Adams Do?" applied to our current times. What would his America First foreign policy look like? And go read for a shorter account. Just go read what we published from Angelo. We published an early chapter from that book, or a version of it, called "What's Russia to Us" in 2019. And this is, of course, 2.5 years before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Angelo's point was Russia's near abroad will always be much, much more important to it than it will be to us. And so we should regard with much trepidation trying to assert ourselves too much in that area. And Angelo has in mind the NATO, the creeping NATO expansion up to Russia's borders that has been going on since the 90s. And he advises us to find ways in which we can stay out of each other's way. That is, the US and Russia can stay out of each other's way. I think our policy instead since the 90s has been to increasingly get in Russia's way. Now, this is Angela was not recommending, of course, complete pusillanimity in the face of any and all Russian offenses against its near abroad, but it is to say to be clear-eyed about what we can't do and what we have the stomach to do and what we don't have the stomach to do. And for Angelo, the touchstone is always on these matters, American public opinion, especially as it's expressed through Congress. And he would advocate over and over again, and he kept beating this drum throughout the Afghanistan and Iraq policies. Let's have this debate in public, in Congress, rather than these ever evolving, permanently running security authorizations, and with the only real oversight by Congress being appropriations. Let's debate this publicly. What are we doing, where, and why? And that's just not a conversation we've had in public for a long time in America, really not in any very serious way, with maybe a few exceptions. Since the end of World War II, an event that reoriented the world through circumstances and chance, but also through, of course, the US intervention in World War II and the fact of our being far removed from the intensity of that conflict and basically being the world's industrial base for the decades following it. That American preeminence had some causes we treat as permanent now and unassailable, and we have really failed to reorient ourselves both vis-a-vis Europe, but also vis-a-vis the former Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, let alone China. In many ways, we're stuck, not in all ways, but in many ways, stuck in lots of Cold War thinking, which obscures rather than helps our ability to judge what is in our interest and how we should proceed. And so this piece is just a great illustration of the latest instantiation of that, which Trump and some of our friends at the State Department and elsewhere are trying to fix now with these negotiations with Russia. We'll see how it goes. I think our negotiators were in Saudi Arabia on a couple of occasions in the last 3 weeks. That is U.S. negotiators from the State Department and with their Russian counterparts and occasionally Ukrainians. I think another round is forthcoming, maybe even this week. I can't remember. It all depends on how the readouts go and how the different sides react. But it's something to watch, and this piece is good background on all of that and on how it ought to proceed. Let's hope and pray that Ukraine and Russia, in their different ways, can do the best that they can get at this point and stop killing each other. And in the meantime, begin to extract ourselves and some of our allies in NATO from the brink, which it seems this article illustrated was a little closer than we had been led to believe. Anyway, go check it out. I don't want to make this an all New York Times podcast episode, but we do have one more thing from the New York Times. This interesting opinions podcast. They have this podcast called A Matter of Opinion, which pulls from their just normal opinions podcast. That's kind of a hybrid of the two. But this exchange between Frank Bruni, Michelle Goldberg, and a third interlocutor who serves as kind of the host of the whole thing. I forget his name at the moment. It's not important. In the piece, his last name is Healy. I forget his first name, but it's revealing in a way. This is their assessment of kind of the first 50 days of Trump, and I'll just read a few paragraphs. Healy is kind of the instigator of this conversation, and Michelle Goldberg is the first to respond. What has she found most shocking about the first 50 days? I thought the way they're thinking about the first 50 days and Trump and his constituents is pretty revealing, and his psychology for that matters. Here it is. There's a few shocking things, but one that stands out for me, again, this is Michelle Goldberg, is the gutting of USAID because it's illegal and because it's flagrantly immoral and utterly self-destructive. During the first Trump term, I would sometimes have to catch myself because even though I thought and think that Trump is uniquely despicable and dangerous, the fact remains that if you just want to look at the number of lives lost and global damage done, George W. Bush really outstripped him. Trump is maybe a worse person, but the damage that he did in his first term was much more contained. I think that in the second Trump term, he's changed that very quickly, not just by taking America's soft power and setting it on fire in all sorts of ways, but really making these abrupt decisions that are going to kill hundreds of thousands and maybe more than 1 million people. And he's doing it in this incredibly arbitrary, careless way. And I just want to say something really quick before we get to Frank. She means Frank Bruni, who'll talk next. I have a 12-year-old son who, as he learns more about various kinds of dark chapters in American history, can get really down on this country. So I often find myself in the strange position of trying to talk up American greatness because I don't want him to feel despair about the country that he's growing up in. It's occurred to me that every single thing that I have pointed out to him as a sign of American greatness or goodness, whether that be foreign aid, whether that be our support for Ukraine, our success in welcoming immigrants and refugees, or scientific preeminence, everything that I thought was best about America, Trump has either destroyed or tried to destroy in less than 2 months. Next excerpt. This is Healy asking Frank Bruni. Frank, do you think that Trump actually cares about any of this destruction that he's undertaking? Or is the destruction the point? By which I mean, I'm not sure if Donald Trump really cares about foreign aid and soft power. And I'm not sure he really cares if he's putting John Bolton at risk or not. They're talking about revocation of security clearances. I feel like he entered his second term wanting to be a doer. It's the action that's the thing. Frank Bruni. I could not agree with you more. I don't think he has a coherent value structure as most of us understand it. I think we're seeing a president who's operating without anything any of us would recognize as a conscience. Truly. It is about showing what he can get away with. It's about showing his enemies that what they support, he can tear down. It is all about displays of brute strength. He gets off on that. And in that sense, it seems not so much an autocracy, but a flexocracy. Oh, thanks, Frank, for the great new term. Let me show you how I can flex my bicep as I use it to power my fist coming into your face. And then some closing thoughts from Bruni. I don't think there are tidy comparisons. He's talking about historical analogies to autocrats and stuff, which Michelle Goldberg had raised. I think it's the overwhelming nature of this all that has so many people sort of numb and tuned out and feeling sort of helpless. To begin to really look hard at Trump's indecencies, at his overreach, at his defiance of the law, at his contempt for norms, is to end up in a black hole from which you can never escape. I bet all three of us feel that emotionally after years of writing and talking about this. So I do think there are many Americans who, because it's so impossible to comprehend the immensity of the departure from the American past, they just really end up concentrating all their worries on the price of eggs. One of our greatest shortcomings as people in the media who are paid to spend time thinking about and analyzing all of this is that we forget how many Americans have these overstuffed, stressful days in which they have a half an hour to follow the news. I mentioned Steve Bannon because he's the big proponent of the flood the zone strategy. They're counting on people tuning out. So first, I mean, Goldberg's comments, you recognize, I'm sure, dear audience, that she regards American decency and greatness as pretty much tracking with the post-war liberal consensus on what the purpose of foreign aid is, what university funding should do for science education, and all the rest. It's this. We've talked about this on this podcast over the years. It's this identification with quote unquote our democracy and the current basket of policy priorities that is blessed and anointed by the New York Times as the opinions of the good and decent people. There's really no acknowledgement that a good half of the country elected Trump to a second term because they wanted to change course on a lot of these things. Foreign aid, US intervention, aid for Ukraine, our conduct towards universities, what we spent money on through USAID, the extent to which the modern administrative state, through its NGO archipelago, funds the left in various ways at home and abroad. I mean, all of this is just received opinion and good work. And to oppose it or to change course or to even run a national political campaign on changing course and then to win that campaign and that electoral majority and then to proceed as if you did win it. This is all now undemocratic, indecent, immoral. It lacks a conscience. So the indictment is really not just of Trump, but of his at least his base, if not some of the feelings of his larger constituency. There's no self awareness about that at all. And this was a point originally brought to my attention, I should acknowledge, by Jonathan Keeperman, who goes as Lomez online. He first flagged this podcast for me. So thank you, Jonathan. The founder of Passage Press, a kind of dissident publishing house, which you should all check out. Just a quick plug for them, because I noticed it today. Jonathan is releasing through Passage Press some of the original versions of the Hardy Boys. So if you're a fan of that series, what has happened over the years is the publisher of the Hardy Boys has made them slightly more PC in various ways. So if you want the originals, Jonathan got his hands on the original texts and has produced some beautiful copies of them. So hand them out to your kids and grandkids. They're very much worth buying, and check out the rest of their offerings. Okay, plug over for Passage Press. And then finally, Bruni's concluding comments. It's this contempt, it's not expressed as contempt, it's expressed as sympathy, but come on. Is that, part of the reason that the Democrats are feckless, they lack leadership, and there's not a hue and cry across the land against Trump's immorality is because, gee, people are living their lives. They're really just worried about inflation, and they don't have time to read the news and be well versed in all these things like we do. So you really can't blame them, but this is one of the many reasons that we have a failing democracy is an irresponsible and ill-informed public. Now, that's not totally incorrect, the ill-informed public part. That's a whole nother question, the declining, general literacy, historical and current events wise of the American public. It's a long tail going back a long time and has a lot to do with the decline of our universities, but so leaving that aside, it's clear that, where Michelle and Frank Bruni fall on this despair about their country, they're really despairing about half the country as they perceive it not having enough time to be as well read as they are.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I before I get into my comments, I'll also throw in a plug for my good friend Jonathan and neighbor in Montana over at Passage Press, and they're good folks. But as far as what you said about this really fascinating New York Times podcast, really unhinged, and you should listen to it just to see, because if the previous piece is kind of the cool, calm, collected deep state sort of setting up a narrative, this is like just the emo side of the left, just venting. And I think they have no theory of mind for the right, right? It's
Yeah.
just, it's inconceivable to them that any thoughtful person could actually want the things that are happening, let alone what I would argue is actually happening, which is the vast majority of thoughtful conservatives, some of whom are not even necessarily like super Trumpy, have looked at the first couple months of the Trump administration as an almost uniquely triumphant time for the right in terms of their priorities. Not that like everything was perfect or not that he didn't have an errant tweet or two, but that there's a lot of people on our side who've thought a lot about this who are delighted by what they're seeing out of the Trump administration. And there's no awareness that this could even happen. There's, I mean, just no subtlety in the thinking, and it's an embarrassment, which is kind of typical for the New York Times editorial page, quite frankly.
No, I think that's right. I mean, the thing that really jumped out to me was just the lack of any reason, any kind of judgment. Again, the American people are somewhat, understandably, like you said, Ryan, I mean, lacking civic knowledge, all those things. We know all those things. We can talk about those things. But I mean, they chose Trump. The election was not really close. He won the popular vote. I mean, especially with that electoral map, that was about as probably close as you can get currently to pretty decisive win and a decisive victory. In all of that, to just act like that these people don't know the first thing about politics, we need to talk to them about the Constitution. There's such thing as separation of powers. I mean, come on. It's just such, an infantile treatment of Americans. These people are their betters. It's just everything you'd kinda read in, like, a meme of what, like, liberal elites do, like limousine liberals. This is exactly what these people have done. I mean, there's just no attempt at all to put them in their shoes and wonder, why did they actually vote for Trump? Oh, the price of eggs. Oh, it's actually going down. They talked about that nonstop. This was recorded a little bit earlier, so they were just going on about that. So obviously, in retrospect, that makes them look very foolish since the price of eggs have gone down quite a bit, which we covered on the podcast last week. But it's just the incessant idea just being propounded that these people are, absolutely illiterates. They just have no sense of anything. They can't govern themselves at all. They, probably should be put away somewhere in some institution, if that's even still legal, which I'm sure they would hate that, but only for their enemies, I guess it would probably be
Yeah,
okay.
just shielded for misinformation, Mike. That would be
Right, that's the thing that really jumped out to me, and then going to, like, the almost meme caricature of, "Oh my gosh, my kid was crying and throwing up and, my three-year-old," and I said, "Why?" And he said, "Trump is destroying the world, he is a unique threat, Hitler needs to be put down." I mean, it's just silly that, like you said, behind the curtain, this is what is really going on behind of this, like, NPR-ish kind of speak and really cool, calm, and collected surface. I mean, it's just absolute insanity going bubbling, just right underneath that.
I should say that the New York Times is a big place, and this is a collection of some of their more partisan and blinkered writers. I'm sure there are not many, but there are some, good reporters at the New York Times who are trying to understand. You see glimpses of it, trying to understand what the Trump revolution starting in 2016 and then carrying through 2024 and on means and trying to grapple with it. But yeah, I think Goldberg and Bruni uniquely embody the kind of liberal hauteur of our current journalistic clerisy, which takes as a given the state of affairs of American government that is post New Deal, but especially post Great Society, that is this large, both on foreign policy and domestic policy, this large bureaucracy and alleged experts who rule mostly beyond the election by election control of the electorate and even of presidents, though, as we've offered in the past, Republicans are always seen as more revolutionary since Nixon, at least, especially since Reagan, to the extent that they want to overturn this order of bureaucratic rule. And so the left regards all of this as now the new permanent state of American government, and to attack it is to be anti science, troglodytic, and reactionary. Whereas I think a lot of the common sense response is this huge establishment that governs largely outside anything I have to say about it needs to be at least reformed, if not substantially overturned. And that's why we voted for this guy again, actually for the third time for a lot of his voters.
Yeah, and Goldberg, she even mentioned, Trump's approval rating is, like, just absolutely plummeting. Like, I just looked at RCP, Real Clear Politics today. I mean, his favorable is 46, his unfavorable is 49. I mean, you look at that, track that back to 2015, his unfavorable numbers were just absolutely massive. So the idea that, oh my gosh, he is just turning off the American people left and right with every new move, these tariffs are a disaster. That's just a joke. That's just not borne out by any kind of data that's really available at all.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up tariffs, Mike, because we wanted to talk about, close out this podcast this week with just a uh, beginning of a discussion about tariffs. I think we should have a tariff episode sometime soon. with some of our friends who study this a lot more and have varied opinions on it, David Goldman and others. But we just wanted to flag that today is this is Trump's language. I'm not necessarily endorsing it or cheerleading for it. Liberation Day on the tariff front. I think he's having a press conference right now outlining what has been sold at various times in different ways, kind of blanket 20% tariff. We have large tariffs on foreign made automobiles coming in. There's been a lot of carve outs at various points, especially with our neighbors in Mexico and Canada, and some non carve outs too. I will note that a lot of this is always smacked to me as a bit of the art of the deal. I think Trump sees recent decades as a disproportionate tariff regime at America's expense, with overall tariffs coming out of the US being, on the whole, much lower than a lot of our allies and partners in Europe and in Canada, and even in Mexico. We'll leave China aside. And so he's trying to overturn this regime with a new approach. And on the art of the deal side of it, I saw that I think Canada's premier today offered that he'd be willing to zero out all tariffs or at least substantially reduce them all if it was met with reciprocity. So that would be great progress because our on various goods, not a blanket tariff, but on various goods like wood and dairy and all sorts of other stuff, Canada has had significantly higher tariffs on America than vice versa. So this could be, I think, the beginning of a cascade effect across our partners in the Western Hemisphere in our approach to tariffs. That's what I hope it is. We'll see. Trump, seems convinced that the fairly quick reallocation of domestic manufacturing, especially on automobiles, where he's talked about it most pointedly in the last week, will redound to Americans' benefit and won't have a great lasting economic impact. I'm a little skeptical of that claim, just in the sense that this reallocation will take longer, I think, than Trump thinks. We'll see. I mean, for the average American, we'll see what the price change results in. I mean, if you're buying a new car, I've seen estimates that'll be a few $1,000s the difference. Anyway, what do you guys make of all this, Jeremy? What's your view of Liberation Day and the
Yeah.
reimposition of a tariff regime that looks a lot more like the McKinley administration than anything we've seen in the recent 50, 60, 70 years?
Yeah, it's a really bold experiment, Ryan, and I'm glad you mentioned the Canada thing because I think the Canada gesture highlights a kind of fundamental question I think a lot of folks have here, which is how much of this really is art of the deal? Like, how much would Trump just declare victory if we wound up with zero tariffs on Canada and vice versa? And on a relative basis, that would make our manufacturing more, or whatever else more competitive with them, or how much is he really dedicated toward this project to the long term that he's going to stick with some of these tariffs because he really does want to see a reallocation of manufacturing. And the way the administration has talked about this is always interesting and delicate. And JD Vance, who of course has a great way of words, sort of has danced around this kind of beautifully from a rhetorical perspective. But let's be clear, what we're really trying to do here is something that is going to consumers in the US have captured a bunch of surplus. That is your average voter. But the downside is that we've totally hollowed out our industrial base, right? Among other things. And that has really profound long term effects on America's competitive position, both commercially, but also in things like militarily, like how much our shipbuilding capabilities are like 1/300th of China or whatever it is. So I think Trump is absolutely great and bold and correct in saying we've got to reorient this, and that he thinks that tariffs are a reasonable way to do that and to make foreigners pay for some significant portion of that. And I do think, Ryan, that the risk here, the kind of known unknown, is how quickly can that be accomplished, right? And at what scale? And I think obviously if these tariffs do go into effect, you'll get some short-term wins, but the businesses are going to need to get a clear sense that he's going to really be sticking with this before they really begin to reallocate massive amounts of manufacturing back here. And then, of course, we tried to do this because of the fecklessness of politicians in both parties who have allowed our manufacturing base to be damaged in the way that it is. It's not just going to be rebuilt instantly in terms of both machines, personnel, everything. And so, there is going to be some messiness. And I think Trump is going to have to, if he really wants to stick with this, kind of grasp for some unifying rhetoric that is really going to explain the long-term vision of this for Americans. And again, I mean, I think that's the right vision, but it's hard. It's a hard thing that he is trying to do, and it'll be interesting to see how far he goes versus how much he might go a little bit of the way and pocket some wins and declare victory.
Yeah, I think in principle, I mean, this makes all the sense in the world to me. Especially, I live right by Cincinnati. So Middletown, Ohio is 25 minutes away. You drive there, and I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, dilapidated houses, people on the corners. You can tell it's really gotten hit hard in the past 30, 40 years from, quote, free trade deals that were really, I mean, huge, long 1,000-page bills with carve outs and giveaways and all that kind of thing. If we actually had free trade, okay, that might be something different, but it's really kind of gone under, crony capitalism as free trade. The proof really is in the pudding with this. Orrin Cass has been great over at American Compass, kind of talking about this, agrees in principle, but the communication side could probably do a little bit of work. And then, too, we'll see with this Liberation Day with what Trump is talking about right now. But communications is key. Trump himself obviously isn't going to run again. Well, he's actually been talking about running again for another term in 2028. I think that's more just, pulling the media's leg and just watching them react than anything else. But Republicans obviously are up in 2026. Historically, the party that's in power, who has won the presidency, is going to lose seats. We'll see. The Senate map, though, is actually fairly good for Republicans. I think the House is too. So this really is a comms operation for Trump. And this just needs to be done, I think, very delicately. Again, that's fine in principle, but it's really in practice, how do they go through this? How do they communicate this to the American people? Prices are obviously going to be going up on some things. How do they mitigate that and say, okay, this is happening, but this is the long term goal, and this will be greatly beneficial to you in the future because we will have just shifted the paradigm in such a way that we are not just some kind of consumerist country, basically without any kind of domestic production to speak of, that we are actually independent and we actually have some heft behind that. So this could just be portending some important things coming up, but it's just really all about the execution.
Yeah, they need a bit more exposition of the plan that is supposed to be trusted, because you mentioned, Mike, that Trump's general platform is fairly popular as he remains pretty much popular in a 50-50 country. But if you describe people the details of tariffs, they're not huge fans of it. So it's the plank that needs the most shoring up, and they need to do a lot more rhetorical work on it. And I think if you laid out for the American people in a common sense way, this is where, yeah, as you said, this is where we're trying to go in the medium and long term, and this is how it's going to get us there. Again, even if you disagree, if someone disagrees with the micro policy aspects of the broad macro tariff approach, they've got to make the case, and they have not been doing that sufficiently so far. Beyond just kind of cheap rhetoric about we're gonna get rid of the IRS and have an external revenue service, and we're just gonna fund everything with tariffs. That anyone who is familiar with the federal budget knows that's impossible. So the income tax, although should be greatly simplified and lowered, is not going to go anywhere for the time being, especially without a constitutional amendment. We're not going to get back to the McKinley era of raising most of our revenue from tariffs, given the transformation of American government over the last century. We have gone over our hour, so we should leave it at that. So I want to thank you all once again for listening to the Roundtable. We can welcome back Spencer next week in triumph on his return from Hungary, and maybe get an update from him on how it all went over there. And thank you all for listening. And if you want to learn more about our work, as always, go to claremont.org. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. Check out everything and the latest at the American Mind at americanmind.org or at ClaremontReviewBooks.com. And then for the latest out of our DC office at dc.claremont.org. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't. Help spread the word. And thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.